Hi guys, tonight we step into the Viking world along frozen northern fjords, where winter does not feel like a season, but like a living force that swallows daylight and reshapes every breath you take. Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to survive in a place where the sun disappears for weeks and the cold presses so hard against your skin that even silence feels heavy? Tonight, you walk through that world where wooden halls glow faintly in the dark and the wind outside sounds almost like something alive. So before you settle into the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what your local time is. Now dim the lights. You stand on the edge of a Viking coastline where the sea looks like hammered iron under a starless sky. The air bites your lungs with each inhale. It feels sharp, almost metallic. Snow drifts sideways, not falling but attacking, pushed by winds that never seem to sleep. Inside the longhouse ahead, warmth is not comfort yet. It is survival carefully built. Thick timber walls hold heat the way a clenched fist holds a spark. You hear the low crackle of firewood burning inside mixed with the soft murmur of voices that never fully rise above the wind outside. You step closer and notice something simple but essential. Every structure here is designed to trap heat, not light. A mainstream historical fact often noted by archaeologists is that Viking longhouses were partially dug into the earth using soil as insulation against Arctic cold. That small detail changes everything about how you understand their world. The smell hits you first when you enter. Smoke animal hide damp wool and burning peat all blend into a thick atmosphere that clings to your clothes. It is not unpleasant to those who live here. It is safety. People sit close together along wooden benches that line the walls. No one wastes space. No one wastes warmth. Even silence is shared. You notice how the fire is never left alone, someone always tends it. A shifting responsibility passed through the night like a quiet ritual. The flames do not simply provide heat, they define time itself. Your eyes adjust slowly. The light reveals carved beams overhead blackened by years of smoke. Everything carries the memory of winters before this one. You feel the floor beneath you vibrate slightly as wind presses against the outer walls. The structure holds, but it never stops feeling like it is being tested. Outside the fjord, wind screams again. Inside, there is only the controlled breathing of a community that has learned how to survive inside the bones of wood and earth. You might imagine Vikings as raiders at sea, but winter tells a different story. Most of life here is not about conquest, it is about endurance. Archaeological evidence suggests that for much of the year, activity slows dramatically, and survival becomes a domestic rhythm rather than a heroic one. A quirky detail that often surprises people is their use of fermented foods that could last through the coldest months. One famous example is fermented shark stored and aged until it becomes edible in a way that outsiders often find challenging to understand. Yet in this world, nothing is wasted if it can extend life through winter. You settle deeper into the rhythm of the hall. Someone laughs quietly in the corner. A child shifts closer to an adult for warmth. The sound of firewood splitting echoes like distant thunder in a controlled scheme. There is still uncertainty among historians about how evenly warmth was distributed in these spaces. Some argue that the central fire was enough to stabilize temperatures across the hall. Others suggest that sleeping areas near the outer walls were still dangerously cold, forcing people to rely more on body heat than architecture alone. You can almost feel that truth in your bones as you imagine it. The edges of the longhouse are colder, quieter, less protected. Survival here is never equal, only shared. You are guided toward the sleeping area where benches line the walls like resting places carved from the structure itself. Furs are spread out in layers, rough but effective. Straw is tucked underneath to trap warmth from the body and block the cold rising from the wood. The air feels heavier near the floor. Heat rises, and those who understand this world know exactly where to place themselves. Even sleep is a strategy. You lie down in imagination now, shoulder to shoulder with others. The closeness is not optional, it is necessary. You feel the faint warmth of bodies around you. the subtle movement of breathing, the shared rhythm of survival. Outside, the wind continues its long argument with the walls. Inside, firelight flickers across half-closed eyes. And somewhere beyond the longhouse, beyond the snow and sea and endless night, the Viking winter waits without mercy. You remain inside the longhouse as the firelight settles into a steady rhythm, and now your attention shifts from warmth itself to the structure that makes warmth possible. The walls around you are not just barriers. They are engineered survival shaped by generations who learned that in this land, architecture is the difference between life and silence. You begin to notice the scale more clearly. The longhouse stretches farther than it first appeared, its length dimly disappearing into shadow. Smoke rises slowly toward the roof beams, then lingers, trapped in a controlled haze, before finding its way out through small openings high above. The air is warm, but never fully clean. It carries memory in every breath. Your footsteps feel muted against packed earth flooring. This is intentional. Many Viking-era homes were built partially sunk into the ground, lowering their profile against the wind and using the earth itself as insulation. That simple design choice changes everything about how heat behaves inside. Instead of escaping outward, warmth gathers and lingers. You move deeper inside and feel the temperature shift subtly. Near the central fire, the heat is sharp and direct, almost overwhelming. But toward the edges, where sleeping benches line the walls, the cold returns in faint waves, dear like something patiently waiting. The structure does not eliminate winter. It negotiates with it. The smell changes as you move. Near the fire, it is smoke and burning resin. Farther out, it becomes wool-dried meat and the earthy scent of straw insulation packed beneath sleeping mats. Everything here has a purpose, even scent itself. Nothing is accidental in a place like this. A mainstream historical observation supported by excavation evidence across Scandinavia is that Viking longhouses often featured a central hearth running lengthwise through the building rather than a single fireplace. This allowed heat to spread more evenly, supporting large communal living spaces where entire households could survive together through winter nights. You picture that arrangement now. A long glowing line of fire stretching through darkness with people arranged along it like carefully placed shadows, each one claiming a share of warmth. The roof above you slopes steeply not for beauty but for survival. Snow slides off rather than accumulating, preventing collapse under weight that could otherwise crush entire families during storms. You can almost hear that snow sliding in your imagination, a soft, shifting pressure above the wood. There is a faint drip somewhere, likely from melted frost forming inside the roof beams. Even in well-built homes, moisture is a constant presence. It freezes, melts, and freezes again, shaping the interior climate in subtle ways. Nothing here is static, not even the walls. You settle near a carved post and run your hand along it. The wood is worn smooth in places where countless hands have rested over years. It feels almost warm now, but you know it is not heat in the wood itself. It is accumulation, life layered upon life. A quieter detail often overlooked is the role of ventilation. Smoke was not just a byproduct, it was part of the design. Too much ceiling would trap heat but also suffocate the inhabitants. So builders left controlled gaps, especially near roof peaks, creating a delicate balance between warmth and breathable air. Historians still argue about how effective these systems were in extreme cold, especially during storms when ventilation openings might let in biting wind. You imagine those nights, wind pressing against every gap, fire struggling to breathe, people adjusting their positions, silently adapting without complaint. Further inside the hall, you notice raised platforms along the walls. These are sleeping areas but also status indicators. In many Viking settlements, placement within the longhouse reflected social standing. Those closer to the fire often held higher importance or greater responsibility. Yet in winter, even status bends to necessity. Warmth overrides pride. You lie back again in imagination and feel how the architecture supports the body. The floor is not flat in the modern sense. It is slightly uneven, shaped by time use and constant repair. Straw beneath you compresses, slowly forming insulation that traps body heat. Above, animal hides are layered carefully, their oils still faintly detectable, repelling moisture from melting frost. A quirky archaeological detail reveals that some Viking homes may have used hanging textiles or carved wooden partitions to divide space, not just for privacy, but to manage airflow and temperature zones within the same hall. In a sense, the longhouse functioned like a primitive climate system, dividing cold and warm areas without mechanical tools. You can almost feel those invisible zones now. Near the door, the cold creeps in with every opening and closing. Near the centre, heat pulses like a heartbeat. Between them lies a gradient of survival carefully maintained, without modern knowledge, only observation and memory. Outside, the wind intensifies again. It presses against the walls with a force that makes the structure respond subtly, a deep groan travelling through timber joints. You feel it in your bones more than your ears, and yet the house holds. That is its quiet miracle. Not perfection, but endurance. You become aware of the people around you again. Someone adjusts a fur blanket. Another adds wood to the fire with practiced timing, not too much, not too little. Even fuel is rationed in rhythm with night itself. There is still uncertainty among historians about how these structures truly performed in prolonged Arctic storms. Some argue that internal temperatures could remain surprisingly stable with proper fire maintenance. Others suggest that extreme weather likely pushed inhabitants to rely heavily on shared body heat, making the architecture only part of the survival equation. You understand both possibilities now without needing to choose between them. The longhouse is not a solution. It is a negotiation with cold that never fully ends. As you remain still, the firelight shifts across the beams overhead. Shadows stretch and contract like breathing shapes. The structure feels alive in its own way, shaped by use, heat and time. Outside, winter continues its long pressure against the world. Inside, wood, earth, fire and human presence hold it back just long enough for life to continue. You remain inside the longhouse, but now your attention narrows to the most essential force shaping everything around you. Fire. Not as a symbol, not as comfort, but as a constant negotiation with death by cold. The crackle of burning wood is steady, almost hypnotic. Each sound carries weight here. You notice how even small shifts in flame change the atmosphere of the entire hall. Heat rises in uneven waves, rolling across sleeping bodies, drifting toward the smoke-darkened beams above. You inhale slowly. The air tastes different now, heavier near the fire, thinner near the walls. Smoke clings to wool and hair, a permanent layer of survival that no one tries to remove. It is not pollution in this world. It is protection. You move your gaze toward the central hearth again. Flames are never allowed to die fully. That is not just tradition. It is necessity. Once lost fire in this environment can be difficult to restart, especially during storms when dry fuel becomes scarce. A mainstream historical fact supported by archaeological findings across Viking settlements is that many longhouses maintained a central hearth running continuously with embers carefully preserved overnight under ash to ensure the fire could be revived rather than rebuilt from scratch each morning. You imagine that moment of responsibility now. Someone kneeling before fading embers in the middle of a freezing night, protecting the last fragile heat like it is more valuable than gold. The fire itself is not large by modern standards, but it feels immense in this enclosed space. Its light flickers across faces, revealing brief expressions before swallowing them again into shadow. There is no steady illumination here, only rhythm. You notice how people orient themselves around it. Bodies angle inward without thought. Feet stretch toward warmth. Hands stay close, absorbing heat like a resource that must be collected carefully. The smell deepens as resinous logs are added. A sharp, almost sweet scent mixes with smoke and damp wool. You realize that smell is part of orientation here. In darkness, scent and heat replace visual certainty. You shift slightly and feel the uneven warmth across your body. One side is almost too hot, the other remains chilled. That imbalance is expected. Survival here is not uniform comfort. It is patchwork adaptation. A quirky detail from Viking Age archaeology suggests that different types of wood were deliberately chosen for specific burning qualities, with some woods preferred for steady heat and others for quick ignition. Even fuel selection was a form of environmental engineering shaped by experience rather than formal science. You can almost picture the gathering of firewood in summer months when forests were accessible and time was not measured by urgency. Every log collected then becomes part of this moment, now burned slowly against winter's pressure. The fire pops suddenly. Sparks lift upward and disappear into smoke. You follow them instinctively until they vanish into the darkness above the beams. There is a faint rhythm to how the fire is managed. Someone adds fuel at intervals that feel almost musical, not too frequently or the room becomes stifling, not too rarely or the cold begins to reclaim the space. This balance is learned, not taught, in formal instruction passed through observation and repetition. You notice how smoke behaves differently depending on airflow. It does not simply rise. It circulates, lingers, then finds exit points near the roof. The design of ventilation here is subtle but critical. Without it, the longhouse would become uninhabitable within hours. Historians still argue about how effective Viking smoke ventilation systems were during prolonged winter use. Some evidence suggests that while smoke was managed, interior air quality often remained harsh by modern standards, contributing to chronic irritation of eyes and lungs among inhabitants. You imagine living with that constant haze, not as an inconvenience, but as normal life is. Around you people shift positions again. A child leans closer to an adult, drawn instinctively towards the warmth. An older figure adjusts their seat slightly nearer the fire, careful not to obstruct airflow. Even movement is governed by invisible rules shaped by heat distribution. You begin to understand something subtle. The fire is not just in the centre of the room, it is in the centre of social order. Who sits closest matters, who tends it matters, who sleeps near it matters. Everything radiates outward from that burning core. A faint crack in the wood echoes through the hall. It sounds like distant thunder trapped indoors. You feel it more than hear it, a vibration through the floor. Outside wind surges again, pressing against the walls with renewed force. The structure responds with a deep, almost living groan, but the fire does not waver. It consumes steadily, indifferent to the storm beyond. You lean back in imagination and feel the contrast more deeply now. Outside is motion, chaos and cold. Inside is controlled destruction, carefully managed energy turning wood into heat into life. There is still uncertainty among historians about how much fuel a Viking household would consume during peak winter months. Estimates vary widely depending on region and social status, but all agree on one thing. Firewood was among the most valuable resources in daily life. You picture the effort behind it. Axes striking frozen timber, hands working in brief daylight, wood stacked carefully protected from snow save for nights like this one. The fire lowers slightly, then steadies again as fresh fuel catches. The balance is restored. You realise that in this world, survival is not about eliminating cold, it is about maintaining a fragile agreement with it. And that agreement is written in flame. You remain in the glow of the longhouse fire, but now your attention shifts away from the structure and flame towards something far more intimate. What you wear. Because in this world, survival is not only built around you, it is worn against your skin, layered like protection against an enemy that never stops moving. You feel the imagined weight of clothing now. Not light fabric, not modern insulation, but dense practical layers designed to trap heat that your body cannot afford to lose. Wool comes first, always closest to the skin rough, but reliable, absorbing moisture while still holding warmth even when damp. You notice how still you must be to understand it properly. Movement changes everything. Every shift of fabric creates a small exchange of heat, a small negotiation with the cold that is never fully absent. A mainstream historical fact supported by textile analysis from Viking burial sites is that wool was the primary material for winter clothing across Scandinavia, valued for its ability to insulate even when wet, which is critical in a climate where snow and ice constantly melt and refreeze on the body. You imagine that now the feeling of damp wool pressed against skin after a journey through snow, not comfortable but necessary. Comfort is not the goal here. Continuity of warmth is over the wool comes fur heavier and more protective. Animal pelts are not just garments, they are portable shelter. You picture thick layers of sheepskin reindeer hide, maybe even seal fur near coastal settlements, each chosen for specific conditions and availability. The smell is stronger here. Animal oil, smoke curing earth, and sweat all merge into something raw and unmistakably alive. It clings to everything, including memory. You run your imagined hands along the outer layer and feel the stiffness where fat and oil have been worked into the hide. This treatment is deliberate. It repels moisture, slows freezing, and keeps wind from cutting directly through fabric layers. Your breath slows as you begin to understand the logic of it. Every layer is doing one job. Wool traps warmth, fur blocks wind, grease resists water. Together they form a system that moves with the body instead of isolating it from the environment. You step outside in imagination for a moment and the difference becomes clear immediately. The wind does not pass through you as easily now. It presses, but it cannot penetrate as deeply. Clothing becomes a second architecture built directly on human form. A quirky detail from experimental archaeology shows that some Viking garments may have included decorative stitching and layered reinforcement in high-stress areas, such as shoulders and elbows, suggesting that even practical clothing carried elements of identity and craftsmanship, not just survival function. You can almost feel those reinforced points now where fabric overlaps, where wear has shaped structure over time. Nothing here is uniform. Everything is adapted through use. Beneath the outer layers, smaller details matter just as much. Belts hold garments tight against the body, preventing cold air from circulating inside clothing layers. Shoes are thick, often made from leather softened, and shaped to withstand both snow and wet ground. Your feet feel heavy in imagination, now insulated but restricted. Each step would be deliberate, careful, because slipping in this environment is not just inconvenient, it is dangerous. You notice how clothing also changes posture. Thick layers limit movement, slightly encouraging slower, more deliberate motion. That slowness is not weakness, it is adaptation. Speed has little value when heat is the resource being preserved. Inside the longhouse, even-seated clothing continues its work. Wool traps the warmth rising from the fire. Fur holds it close. Layers compress slightly under body weight, forming insulating pockets that retain heat through long nights. You shift slightly and feel how heat distribution changes. One side warms more quickly near the fire, the other retains the stored warmth of your own body. Clothing becomes a mediator between these two sources of temperature. Historians still debate how extensively grease or oil treatments were applied to everyday Viking clothing. Some evidence suggests it was common among coastal communities exposed to harsher wet winds, while inland groups may have relied more on tightly woven wool alone. You imagine the difference between those lives. One shaped by salt air and freezing spray, another by inland frost and still forests. Clothing adapts to geography as much as to season. A faint sensory detail emerges now in your mind. The sound of fabric brushing against itself as people shift positions in the longhouse. It is soft, constant, almost like breathing. Clothing is not censored, not silent here. It participates in life. You notice how even rest is shaped by layers. People do not undress fully. Removing too many layers risks losing accumulated warmth. Sleep happens inside clothing as much as outside it. You lie back in imagination again, feeling the weight of wool and fur forming a protective shell around your body. It is not light, it is grounding, almost reassuring in its heaviness. Outside wind presses against the longhouse again. The structure holds. Inside clothing and firework together, two systems of survival layered over human life. And slowly you begin to understand something deeper. In this world there is no separation between person, shelter and environment. Everything is part of the same defense against cold. You step away from the warmth of clothing and fire, and now your mind moves outward beyond the longhouse walls into the frozen landscape that makes all of this necessary. Because nothing inside this hall exists in isolation. Every layer of survival depends on what is taken from the world outside. You imagine the fjord again, but now it is quieter in a different way. Not peaceful, but emptied. Ice stretches across water like a lid sealing something vast beneath. Snow drifts over uneven ground, hiding cliffs, rocks, and danger beneath a soft, deceptive surface. The cold here is not still. It moves, it seeps into everything. Even sound feels different, absorbed and flattened by thick winter air. You begin to understand why food is never just stored in this world. It is hunted, gathered, and defended against time itself. A mainstream historical fact supported by archaeological and saga evidence is that coastal Viking communities regularly hunted seals and occasionally whales during winter months, using ice-edge hunting techniques to secure high-fat meat essential for surviving long periods of darkness and cold. You can almost feel the edge of that ice now, thin in places, thick in others, always uncertain. Hunters moving carefully across frozen surfaces, testing each step, listening for cracks that could mean danger beneath their feet. The smell of the sea rises faintly in your imagination. Salt mixed with ice, cold so sharp it feels like it has texture. You picture the moment of the hunt. Silence broken only by wind. Then sudden motion. A seal surfacing through a breathing hole in the ice. Spears thrown with precision born from necessity, not sport. There is no excess here. Every successful hunt is measured in days of survival. A quirky detail often mentioned in ethnographic comparisons is that some northern hunting groups used specialized tools to locate breathing holes in ice, sometimes marking them for repeated use, turning frozen landscapes into mapped survival routes invisible to outsiders. You can almost see those invisible maps now, paths across ice that only experience can read, land and sea blending into a single dangerous surface. Beyond the ice whales move slowly beneath the frozen world. Hunting them was rare, dangerous, and communal. You imagine the coordination required multiple boats working together in freezing water, strength and timing determining success or failure. Even thinking about it makes the cold feel deeper. You return your focus to smaller scale survival. Seal meat blubber, fish preserved for winter use. Fat becomes more valuable than gold in this environment. Not for wealth, but for heat. Inside the longhouse, you now understand every stored food source represents a future fire. Calories become warmth. Warmth becomes life. You imagine storerooms carved into earth or tucked behind wooden partitions filled with dried fish hanging in rows. Smoked meat hardened by wind and time barrels sealed against moisture and rot. The smell would be intense. Smoke, salt, animal fat and cold air mixing into something both preserved and alive. A mainstream archaeological observation is that Viking settlements often relied heavily on drying, smoking and fermentation techniques to preserve food through winter, as freezing alone was not always reliable due to fluctuating coastal temperatures and humidity. You picture summer now as a completely different world. A brief explosion of activity, fish laid out in wind, meat hung from beams, smoke rising constantly as every household prepares for the months when nothing will grow, nothing will easily move, and everything will depend on what was saved. That contrast feels almost surreal. You shift your attention back to the hunters, their hands raw from cold, breath-forming clouds in freezing air. Each trip outside the settlement is a negotiation with risk. Too long outside and exposure becomes dangerous. Too short and food stores fail. Historians still debate how often winter hunting expeditions were successful in extreme northern conditions. Some argue that communities relied more heavily on stored food than active hunting once deep winter set in, while others suggest opportunistic hunting remained crucial throughout the season. You imagine both truths existing at once. Some winters generous, others merciless. The wind rises in your imagination again, sweeping across ice fields. It does not care about human effort. It erases footprints. It reclaims paths as quickly as they are made. and yet life continues. Back in the longhouse that hunted food becomes something different. It is no longer risk. It becomes heat shared among bodies gathered close to firelight. It becomes strength for another night. You begin to see the pattern more clearly now. Outside is extraction. Inside is transformation. Cold becomes food. Food becomes fire. Fire becomes life. And life becomes the only thing that matters when the sun disappears. You remain with the memory of hunting fading behind you, but now your attention shifts to something quieter, more patient and just as essential. Water that has turned to ice and the hidden life beneath it. You imagine standing on a frozen expanse where land and sea blur together. The surface is solid, but it is not lifeless. Beneath it, water still moves slow and dark, carrying fish that survive in a world sealed from above. The air feels thinner here in your imagination. Every breath sharpens the inside of your nose. Sound is reduced to wind and the faint creak of ice adjusting under pressure. You notice small figures moving across the frozen surface, carefully, deliberately. This is not a place for haste. It is a place for precision. A mainstream historical fact supported by archaeological and ethnographic parallels in northern societies is the winter fishing through ice holes was a crucial food source for many Viking communities, providing access to cod haddock and other cold water species when other resources were limited. You picture the process now. A small hole cut through thick ice using tools shaped by repeated generations of necessity. The ice is not thin. In many cases, it is strong enough to support a person's full weight without cracking. The sound of striking ice echoes in your mind. Controlled, repetitive. Each strike chips away at a barrier between survival and emptiness. When the hole finally opens, the contrast is almost unsettling. Dark water beneath bright ice, a hidden world suddenly exposed. You imagine a line lowered carefully into that blackness. Fingers numb movement, slow breath, held without realizing it. Waiting becomes part of the labor. The cold here is different. It does not move like a wind. It presses evenly from all directions. Even time feels slowed. A quirky detail often mentioned in northern ethnographic studies is that some fishing groups use natural markers such as frozen bubbles or ice cracks to locate productive fishing spots, reading subtle patterns in ice as signs of underwater movement. You can almost see those patterns now, lines and shapes etched into frozen surfaces like forgotten language. To the untrained eye, meaningless. To experienced survivalists, a map. Inside the water below, fish move in slow arcs. Their existence is unaffected by the freezing world above. That contrast feels almost surreal. Two worlds stacked on top of each other, separated by only a few feet of ice. You imagine the moment a line tenses, a sudden pull, the body reacting instantly, hands gripping rope or wood, pulling upward with controlled force. Each catch is not just food, it is time. Time extended for one more night. You begin to understand how deeply winter defines rhythm here. Fishing is not constant, it is opportunistic, dictated by weather, ice thickness and survival need. Every decision carries consequence. A mainstream historical observation is that Viking coastal settlements often combined fishing with small-scale agriculture and animal husbandry, creating a diversified subsistence system that reduced reliance on any single food source during harsh winters. You picture that system now as a fragile balance. Sealand and stored food all contributing to survival like interlocking pieces. You shift your focus back to the frozen surface. Wind sweeps across it, erasing tracks almost immediately. Anything not anchored in place is temporary. There is still uncertainty among historians about how dangerous ice fishing was in practice. Some argue that it was relatively stable when ice was thick and predictable, while others emphasize the risk of sudden thaw cycles and hidden weak points that could cause fatal accidents. You imagine those risks silently present beneath every step. A crack in the ice is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is subtle. A sound too soft to notice until it becomes too late. And yet people still go out. Because inside the longhouse fire burns only as long as fuel exists. And fuel comes from this frozen world. You begin to feel the connection more clearly now. The longhouse does not create survival. It receives it. Outside ice and water produce food, inside fire and bodies convert it into life. Even returning from fishing is a transformation. Frozen fish carried back into warmth thawing slowly near firelight, becoming nourishment shared among many. You imagine the smell now. Cold water, salt, smoke and wood fire blending together as preparation begins again. The world outside remains silent but not empty. It is constantly producing what the inside depends on. You take a deeper breath in your imagination and feel the scale of it all. Winter is not just a season here. It's an entire system of exchange between humans and environment governed by patience, risk and repetition. And every line lowered into frozen water is part of that system. You leave the frozen water behind in your mind and now you return to the longhouse again. But something has changed in your awareness. You're no longer only seeing warmth, fire and shelter. You're beginning to notice what makes all of it possible before winter even arrives. Storage, preparation, the quiet labour of the months when the world is still open. You imagine the brief Viking summer now almost like a memory that belongs to someone else. The air is softer, wetter, full of movement. Rivers run free, soil is workable, and every moment carries urgency that does not exist in winter, because winter is always coming. Inside this imagined summer, people move constantly, not in panic but in rhythm, cutting, drying, salting, smoking. Every action is directed toward a future that will be cold, dark and unyielding. A mainstream historical fact supported by archaeological evidence is that Viking societies relied heavily on drying and smoking techniques to preserve meat and fish, allowing them to store food for months and maintain stable supplies throughout long winters. You picture long wooden racks outside settlement walls filled with strips of fish and meat hanging in wind. Smoke rises continuously from small fires below, not for cooking, but for preservation. Time itself is being slowed down through heat and airflow. The smell must have been overwhelming. Salt smoke, animal fat and earth mixing together in layers that cling to everything. Even the air seems thick with preparation. You notice how nothing is wasted. Every part of an animal is used. Meat for food, fat for fuel, skins for clothing, bones for tools. Waste is not a concept that survives here. You shift your attention to storage spaces, dark, cool rooms dug into earth or built into the back of longhouses, barrels lined in rows, bundles wrapped tightly in cloth, hanging food arranged like suspended time. Each stored item is a promise, a future meal, a future fire, a future day that will not end in hunger. A quirky detail often noted by archaeologists is that some Viking storage pits were sealed with layers of turf and stone, creating natural refrigeration systems that could preserve food far longer than open-air methods alone. You can almost feel the coolness of those spaces now. Damp earth, still air. A silence different from winter silence, not hostile but protective. Inside the longhouse in winter, you understand this stored food becomes something transformative. It is not just survival, it is momentum carried forward from a different season. You imagine someone breaking open a storage container during deep winter. The sound of lid or leather wrapping opening. The release of preserved smell, rich and dense, carrying months of preparation into the present moment. Every meal in winter is a reminder of past labor. You notice how storage changes social behaviour as well. Those who contributed more during harvest months hold influence during winter months. Survival is tied to participation in preparation, not just endurance. There is still uncertainty among historians about how evenly food distribution was managed in Viking households during scarcity. Some suggest strong communal sharing systems, while others point to evidence of status-based allocation in certain settlements. You imagine both possibilities coexisting depending on region and circumstance. Some halls generous and shared, others tightly controlled by hierarchy. Outside wind continues to shape the landscape, but storage resists it in a quiet way. Food sealed underground does not feel the wind, it waits. You begin to understand something deeper now. Winter survival is not built in winter, it is built in summer. Every strip of dried meat, every barrel of preserved fish, every hidden storage pit is a fragment of future warmth. Back in the longhouse, you imagine those supplies slowly being brought out, one by one, not quickly, not wastefully, each item measured carefully against remaining winter days. The smell of stored food mixing with smoke becomes part of daily life. Not fresh, but reliable, familiar. You feel the rhythm of it now. Summer creates, winter consumes. The balance between them defines everything. And somewhere in that balance, life continues without pause. Because nothing here is ever truly finished. It is only stored waiting for its moment to return. You remain in the rhythm of stored food and slow-burning fire, but now your attention shifts from objects of survival to the people who organize it. Because nothing in this world exists without structure, and structure here is not abstract. It is lived every hour of every freezing night. You begin to notice how the longhouse is not only a shelter but a map of relationships. Every position, every task, every shared responsibility reflects a quiet hierarchy that keeps survival from collapsing into chaos. You imagine the household as a living system, not equal but interconnected. Some tend the fire, some distribute food, some maintain tools. Others manage livestock or guard the entrance against cold wind that never stops pressing against the walls. A mainstream historical fact supported by Sega literature and archaeological interpretation is that Viking households often operated under strong social hierarchies led by a household head whose control over food distribution and labour organisation became especially important during winter scarcity. You feel that structure now in how space itself is used. The closer you are to the fire, the more central your role tends to be. The farther you are, the more peripheral your influence becomes. Even warmth has a social geography. You notice how people move within the hall with purpose, never aimless. Someone adds fuel to the fire, someone adjusts sleeping arrangements, someone checks stored supplies. Every action maintains balance. The sound of the hall is not chaotic, it is layered. Fire crackling wood, shifting low voices, exchanging necessary information, the occasional step across packed earth floor. Even silence feels organised. You realise that survival here depends on trust. Not emotional trust alone, but functional trust. Trust that others will maintain fire while you sleep. Trust that food will be shared according to need and role. Trust that no single failure will break the system. A quirky detail often suggested by ethnographic comparisons is that some Viking communities likely used informal signalling systems within households, such as specific calls, knocks, or routines to coordinate tasks in low visibility conditions during long winter nights. You can almost hear those subtle signals now. A shift in tone before someone speaks, a pause before movement, a rhythm that replaces daylight as a guide for action. You imagine children observing all of this, quietly learning without instruction. They do not attend lessons, they absorb patterns. Who speaks when, who eats first, who sits where, and the survival is taught through repetition of daily life. There is still uncertainty among historians about how rigid Viking household hierarchies truly were across regions. Some evidence suggests flexible cooperative arrangements in smaller settlements, while larger farms and chieftain households likely enforced stricter divisions of labour and authority. You hold both possibilities in your mind at once. A world not uniform but varied by place and circumstance. You notice how even warmth is distributed according to structure. Those near the centre receive more heat not by accident but by design and social arrangement. Position becomes comfort. Comfort becomes influence. Outside, the wind presses again against the longhouse. Inside, structure holds it back, not only physically but socially. Without coordination, the cold would win quickly. You begin to see hierarchy differently now, not as control alone, but as a survival mechanism. Someone must decide how limited resources are shared. Someone must ensure fire does not die. Someone must watch the edges where cold enters. A mainstream historical observation is that Viking society, while often associated with individual strength and independence, still relied heavily on communal labour systems within households and farms, especially during winter, when survival required coordinated effort. You imagine disputes happening quietly, not loudly, decisions made near the fire, adjustments made through action rather than debate. Survival leaves little room for extended disagreement. You shift your focus to the rhythm of night again. The fire is maintained, supplies are checked, people settle into rest in assigned or habitual places, even sleep is part of structure. You lie back in imagination and feel how organization becomes comfort in its own way. Knowing what comes next reduces fear even when cold remains present. There is still uncertainty among historians about how formalized Viking household roles truly were in everyday life, but most agree that some form of structured cooperation was essential in environments where individual failure could endanger entire groups. You understand that now without needing certainty. The Longhouse does not survive because of strength alone. It survives because everyone has a place within it. Outside, winter continues without structure or direction. Inside, structure pushes back, and between them life continues in fragile balance. You remain inside the Longhouse surrounded by structure fire and quiet coordination, but now something shifts in the atmosphere. The practical rhythm of survival softens slightly, and another force begins to fill the space. Memory. Because when winter night stretches too long and darkness refuses to leave, people begin to live as much in stories as in the physical world around them. You notice it first in the way voices change, softer now, less transactional. The fire still crackles, but conversation lingers longer like it does not want to end. You imagine bodies gathered closer, not only for warmth but for listening. Someone begins a story, not announced, not formal. It simply begins as naturally as fire-catching would. A mainstream historical fact supported by saga literature is that oral storytelling, including sagas and genealogical histories, was a central part of Norse culture, especially during winter months when travel and outdoor labour were reduced and communities gathered indoors for long evenings. You lean into that idea now. The Longhouse becomes something different. Not only shelter but memory space. A place where identity is maintained through spoken words rather than written records. The air feels different when stories begin. Still smoky, still warm, but charged with attention. Even the fire seems to quiet slightly as if it is listening too. You hear the cadence of a storyteller in your mind. Slow, measured, each sentence shaped carefully so it can survive repetition. Because in this world, stories are not told once. They are carried forward, reshaped by memory, but anchored in meaning. You notice how people respond. Small reactions, a shift in posture, a quiet laugh, a pause that suggests recognition. Storytelling is not performance here. It is participation. A quirky detail often mentioned in studies of oral tradition is that genealogical storytelling in Viking Age societies could extend across many generations, sometimes tracing lineages so carefully that social identity itself was reinforced through repeated recitation during communal gatherings. You can almost feel that layering of memory now, each story adding weight to the present moment, connecting individuals to something larger than the immediate cold outside. Outside, winter erases tracks, inside, stories restore continuity. You imagine sagas being told across nights like this. Heroes' voyages, conflicts, and journeys across sea and ice. Not as distant entertainment, but as shared cultural memory reinforcing identity during isolation. The smell of the room deepens again in your awareness. Smoke, wool, fur, and now something else. Attention, concentration, the subtle stillness of people listening together. You shift slightly and realize that even silence has changed. It is no longer empty, it is expectant. There is still uncertainty among historians about how closely oral sagas preserved historical accuracy over generations. Some argue they reflect real events shaped by memory, while others suggest they blend history with myth in ways that are impossible to fully separate. You hold both ideas gently, truth and imagination existing side by side, both necessary in a world without written certainty. You imagine a child listening from the edge of the firelight, not fully understanding but absorbing rhythm, structure, tone, learning not just what happened, but how meaning is formed. The fire pops softly again, a small interruption in the flow of voice. Even that becomes part of the atmosphere. You notice how storytelling changes time. Hours feel shorter when words carry attention. Cold remains outside, but it loses its dominance inside perception. A mainstream historical observation is that oral traditions in Norse culture often served multiple functions, including entertainment, moral instruction, and preservation of social memory, especially during long winter periods when communities relied heavily on shared indoor life. You begin to feel that layering now. A story is not escape, it is structure within survival. It organizes thought the same way fire organizes heat. You imagine different voices taking turns across the winter season, each night continuing where another left off. Memory maintained collectively, not individually. The longhouse for a moment feels less like a building and more like a vessel carrying voices through darkness. You sit within it listening. Outside wind continues its endless movement, unchanged and indifferent. Inside stories hold it back, not physically but in meaning, and for a while the cold feels less absolute. You remain in the glow of shared stories, but now the longhouse shifts again almost imperceptibly as night deepens and bodies begin to prepare for rest. The fire still burns steady and low, but attention is no longer fully on speaking. It turns inward towards sleep and survival through stillness. You notice how space is rearranged without ceremony. People move closer to the walls, settling into familiar places. The longhouse, once filled with movement and voice, becomes quieter in layers rather than all at once. You imagine the sleeping arrangements more clearly now. Long wooden benches built along the interior walls raise slightly off the ground to reduce contact with cold air. These are not individual beds, they are shared platforms of survival. A mainstream historical fact supported by archaeological evidence from Viking settlements is that communal sleeping arrangements were common, with families and workers often sleeping side by side on benches or platforms to conserve body heat during extreme winter conditions. You lie back in imagination and feel that closeness now. Not social closeness in the modern sense, but physical necessity. Heat is not personal here. It is shared, pooled, distributed among bodies. The air near the floor is colder. You notice it even in stillness. Cold does not disappear at night. It simply settles differently. Warm air rises, leaving lower spaces more vulnerable. You feel how carefully people position themselves. Those with thicker furs or greater resilience toward outer edges. Others closer to the fire where warmth is strongest but smoke is heavier. Placement is never random. A quirky detail often suggested in experimental archaeology discussions is that Viking sleeping spaces may have been rotated or adjusted seasonally within longhouses to account for shifting wind patterns and fire efficiency, showing an adaptive approach to interior space even during winter months. You imagine that slow seasonal adjustment, not renovation but quiet adaptation, moving sleeping position slightly, changing orientation, learning the building as if it were alive and responsive. You hear the subtle sounds of settling, a fur being pulled tighter, a body shifting onto straw bedding, the faint creak of wood under weight. These sounds replace speech now. You notice how bedding is layered, straw closest to the wood floor acting as insulation against cold surfaces. Above it, animal hides, thick and slightly uneven, shaped by use and time. Everything designed to trap warmth that the body produces naturally. You can almost feel that warmth building slowly now as bodies rest. Not immediate heat, but accumulated heat, shared heat. A mainstream historical observation is that Viking bedding often relied on a combination of straw mats and animal furs materials that were readily available and effective at reducing heat loss to cold wooden or earthen floors. You settle deeper into that imagined space. The sensation is not comfort in the modern sense, it is containment. Warmth held in place by layers above and below. The fire continues to burn, but lower now, managed carefully so it does not consume fuel too quickly. Someone remains awake to tend it. That role never disappears fully during winter nights. You sense that quiet responsibility, The difference between sleep and disaster is often one person's attention to flame. There is still uncertainty among historians about how strictly Viking households organised night watches during winter. Some evidence suggests rotating responsibilities, while other interpretations point to more informal systems based on proximity and necessity. You imagine both systems blending naturally. No strict schedule, but shared awareness. A community that listens even while resting. Outside wind presses against the longhouse again. The sound is deeper now, less chaotic, more continuous. Like the world itself breathing heavily against the structure. Inside, bodies begin to synchronize with rest. Breathing slows, movement fades. The longhouse becomes still without becoming empty. You feel the contrast clearly now. Outside is motion without rest, inside is rest without escape. And between those two states, survival continues quietly through the night. You close your imagined eyes. The fire remains, the structure holds, and winter waits just beyond the walls. You remain in the slow rhythm of sleep gathering inside the longhouse, but now your awareness drifts downward, away from Balt's firelight and voices toward what supports you when everything else fades into darkness. The bedding beneath you is no longer just a surface, it becomes a system. A quiet layered barrier between your body and the frozen ground beneath the structure. You feel the imagined texture first. Rough straw compressed into uneven mats, slightly springy under weight. It is not soft in a modern sense, but it is intentional. Each stalk traps air, and trapped air is what holds warmth in this world. A mainstream historical fact supported by archaeological finds in Viking settlements is that straw bedding was widely used as insulation beneath sleeping areas, often combined with animal hides to reduce heat loss to cold floors during winter nights. You settle into that idea more deeply now. The floor beneath Viking life is never neutral. It pulls heat downward relentlessly. Without insulation, sleep becomes a slow exchange of warmth for cold. Above the straw you imagine animal furs layered carefully, thick, uneven, shaped by use. Some still carry faint traces of oil or smoke. Others are softened through years of handling. Each one is a shield not only against cold air, but against moisture rising from the ground. You notice how still everything feels in this imagined space. Even the fire sounds distant now, as if the hall itself is holding its breath. Your body lies within multiple layers at once, straw beneath, fur above, clothing still worn. Each layer doing a different part of the same task, preserving warmth. A quirky detail often discussed in experimental archaeology is that bedding layers in northern climates may have been periodically shifted or fluffed to restore insulating air pockets, showing that even rest required small acts of maintenance to remain effective. You imagine someone doing that now in the dim light. Quiet hands adjusting hides, straw being loosened slightly, small corrections that preserve comfort against gradual heat loss. You feel how temperature behaves differently here, not stable but layered. Warmth near the body fades slowly outward. Cold presses from below and around, always trying to return. You adjust slightly in imagination and notice how position matters. Even small shifts change how heat is retained. Curling closer reduces exposed surface area. Turning slightly changes airflow under blankets. Sleep itself becomes a series of subtle survival decisions. A mainstream historical observation is that in extreme cold environments, shared sleeping arrangements significantly improve heat retention, with body proximity serving as a critical survival strategy in pre-modern societies without advanced insulation. You become aware again of the others around you, not visually, but through presence. Breathing movement, faint warmth leaking through shared space. You're not alone in the dark. That fact itself becomes warmth. The longhouse creaks softly. Wood responds to the temperature changes throughout the night. Expansion and a contraction are constant, almost like the building is breathing alongside its inhabitants. Outside wind shifts direction. The sound changes slightly, pressing now against a different side of the structure. But inside the effect is softened, diffused through thick timber and earth-packed walls. You imagine frost forming along exterior surfaces, ice building slowly where warm air escapes and meets freezing wind. The boundary between inside and outside is never clean. It is a zone of constant transformation. There is still uncertainty among historians about how effective combined straw and fur bedding was during prolonged Arctic conditions, especially in poorly insulated structures. Some argue it was sufficient only when combined with close body proximity and constant fire maintenance. You hold that uncertainty gently. It does not weaken the image, it deepens it. Because survival here is never a single solution. It is accumulation. Layer upon layer of imperfect protections that together become enough. You feel your awareness soften as sleep deepens. The fire is still present somewhere in the hall, but it no longer demands attention. It simply continues. The longhouse remains stable. Bodies remain warm enough. The night continues its slow passage. And in that fragile balance between cold pressing from the earth and heat held within shared breath, rest becomes possible. You remain within the longhouse's fragile warmth, but now your awareness drifts towards something quieter and more intimate than shelter or fire. It turns toward the body itself and how it responds when cold begins to push past even the strongest walls and thickest furs. Because in this world, survival is not only about avoiding cold, it is also about surviving what cold does to you when it reaches you anyway. You imagine a moment outside the longhouse where breath turns instantly into mist. Skin tightens under frost. Fingers lose sensation not suddenly but gradually, like a slow fading of connection to the world. Inside, someone may return from that edge at any time, and when they do, the body carries the memory of cold into the warmth. A mainstream historical fact supported by archaeological and ethnographic parallels is that frostbite and cold-related injuries were common risks in northern climates, and traditional societies often relied on immediate rewarming techniques and folk remedies to reduce tissue damage. You picture that process now, a person entering the longhouse moving slowly at first, not because they are calm, but because their body is recalibrating. The firelight meets them like a threshold between two worlds. Hands are brought close to heat, not directly into flame, but near enough to begin the slow return of circulation. Fingers that felt distant begin to ache as warmth returns. That ache is not pleasant. It is life returning. You notice how the longhouse changes slightly in response. People make space, not dramatically, but instinctively. Warmth becomes a shared resource again redirected toward recovery. A quirky detail often mentioned in historical medical studies of northern communities is that some traditional frostbite treatments included gradual warming, using warm water or heated stones carefully controlled to avoid causing further tissue damage from rapid temperature change. You imagine that care now. Heated stones wrapped in cloth. Warmth applied slowly, deliberately. Not urgency, but control. In this world, rushing warmth can be as dangerous as losing it. The smell in the hall shifts slightly as damp clothing meets fire heat. Wet wool, thawing fur, and smoke combine into a heavier atmosphere. It is not comfortable, but it is familiar. It means survival continues. You become aware of how the body itself becomes part of the environment. Breath, temperature, circulation all responding to external pressure. Nothing inside a Viking winter exists in isolation, including human physiology. A mainstream historical observation is that prolonged exposure to cold climates often required adaptation, not just in clothing and shelter, but in daily behavioral patterns, with communities learning to minimize heat loss through reduced movement and careful pacing of physical effort. You feel that slowness now. Movement is economical, energy is preserved, even thought feels quieter, less fragmented. You imagine someone rubbing their hands together near the fire, not for comfort alone, but to restore function. Another adjusting boots or wrapping fur tighter around exposed skin. These are small acts, but they matter deeply. Outside wind continues its pressure against the structure. Inside the fire responds steadily, consuming wood, producing heat, maintaining balance. There is still uncertainty among historians about how effectively Viking communities understood the long-term physiological impacts of repeated cold exposure. Some evidence suggests practical knowledge of symptoms and treatment, even if the underlying science was not formally understood. You accept that gap in knowledge gently. What matters here is not explanation but response. They learned what helped, and they repeated it. You feel the rhythm of the hall again. Someone tending fire, someone resting, someone quietly recovering from cold exposure. Life organised around temperature in its most direct form. And slowly you understand something deeper about this world. Cold is not just outside, it is something that must constantly be managed inside the body as well. But here within firelight and shared warmth, it is kept at the edge of control. Not eliminated, just held back. You remain in the slow pulse of warmth inside the longhouse, but now your attention shifts from the human body back toward the structure itself. Because even the strongest bodies here are only as safe as the walls that hold the wind at bay. And in a Viking winter, those walls are never simple wood. They are layered defences shaped by earth, turf, timber and tamam. You begin to imagine the outer surface of the longhouse more clearly now. Thick wooden beams form the skeleton, but they are not left exposed. Instead, they are packed, covered and reinforced with earth and sod, creating a living insulation that blends building with landscape. A mainstream historical fact supported by archaeological reconstructions of Norse settlements is that many Viking longhouses used turf walls in combination with timber framing, significantly improving insulation by using dense earth layers to block wind and retain interior heat. You feel that now in your imagination. The walls are no longer just barriers. They are heavy breathing masses of soil and wood holding back the pressure of winter like a grounded shield. Outside wind does not simply touch these walls, it presses into them. It is absorbed, diffused, reduced to something less violent before it ever reaches the interior. You run your awareness along the inside surface of the hall. The timber is warm in places near the fire but cooler toward the edges, where the cold still finds subtle ways to exist. Moisture clings in invisible layers. Frost forms where heat escapes and meets freezing air. The boundary between inside and outside is not sharp. It is gradual, a slow transition zone where survival is constantly negotiated. A quirky detail often discussed in experimental archaeology is that turf-insulated structures could become even more effective over time as compacted earth settled and hardened effectively, improving insulation with age rather than degrading like modern materials. You imagine that slow strengthening. A building that becomes better at protecting life simply by enduring winter after winter. The smell inside the walls is complex now in your awareness. Smoke absorbed into timber. Earth dampness from turf. Animal presence. Fire residue. It is not clean, but it is stable. It is the smell of containment. You notice how sound behaves differently here. The turf and timber absorb noise, softening the wind outside into something less sharp. Even storms feel distant, as if filtered through layers of earth. A mainstream historical observation is that turf-based insulation was widely used in Northern European architecture, not only for thermal efficiency, but also for acoustic dampening, creating quieter interiors during harsh weather conditions. You feel that quiet now more deeply, not silence but a muted world beyond the walls. Inside life continues in contained rhythm. Fire crackles, bodies shift, breath moves through warm air. Outside wind exists as pressure rather than sound. You imagine builders constructing this longhouse during a warmer season, cutting turf from the ground, lifting heavy sod blocks, placing them carefully over timber frames. Each piece of earth becomes part of the building's future resistance against cold. There is still uncertainty among historians about how standardized turf construction techniques were across different Viking regions. Some settlements appear to have relied more heavily on timber, while others used substantial earthworks, depending on local terrain and available resources. You accept that variation easily now. This is not a single method. It is a range of adaptations shaped by environment. You shift your attention again to the threshold of the building. The doorway is the most vulnerable point. Every opening is a moment when cold tries to enter directly. Even brief movement creates exchange between inside heat and outside frost. You imagine people carefully managing the threshold, doors opening only when necessary. bodies moving quickly to minimize heat loss. Even entry becomes a practice skill. Outside that threshold, winter is immediate. Inside, winter is delayed. The turf walls do not remove danger, they slow it. And in a world like this, slowing danger is enough to preserve life. You feel that truth settle quietly in your awareness. The longhouse is not a barrier that defeats winter. It is a buffer that negotiates with it. And negotiation here is survival. You remain inside the longhouse where warmth is carefully held and winter is kept at a distance. But now your mind moves beyond the walls again. Not into stillness, but into motion, into travel, into what happens when survival must continue outside the safety of firelight and turf. Because winter in Viking lands does not stop movement, it only makes it more dangerous. You imagine stepping out into a storm. The moment the door opens, the world changes instantly. Heat is pulled away from your body as if it is being taken rather than lost. Wind hits like a physical force, not sound but pressure. Snow does not fall gently here. It moves sideways, driven by winds that erase direction and distance. A mainstream historical fact supported by sagas and environmental studies is that winter travel in medieval Scandinavia was often severely restricted during storms, with many journeys postponed or abandoned due to the extreme risk of exposure and disorientation in blizzard conditions. You take a step in imagination and immediately the ground becomes uncertain. Snow hides uneven terrain. Ice forms invisible layers beneath fresh powder. Every step is a negotiation with instability. Breathing becomes sharper, shorter. Each inhale feels colder than the last. You imagine travellers wrapped tightly in furs, faces partially covered, eyes narrowed against blowing snow. Their movements are slow, deliberate, conserving energy. Speed is not safety here. Control is. A quirky detail often mentioned in northern travel accounts is the use of recognisable landmarks such as rock formations, ridge lines or coastal contours as essential navigation anchors, since storms could erase all traces of paths within hours. You can almost feel that dependence now, the world reduced to a few known points in an otherwise shifting white void. Inside your imagination, a traveller pauses. Visibility drops suddenly. The horizon disappears. Even sound becomes unreliable as wind direction masks distance and origin. At this moment, decision matters more than strength. Turn back or continue, shelter or risk. You notice how quickly winter forces judgment. There is no gradual escalation. Conditions can shift within minutes from manageable to life-threatening. A mainstream historical observation is that Viking Age communities likely developed strong experiential knowledge of weather patterns, enabling them to interpret subtle environmental cues to avoid travel during dangerous winter conditions. You imagine that knowledge now, the fill-off air pressure changes. The behaviour of clouds before storms, the way animals react differently in approaching cold fronts. These are not formal forecasts, they are learned instincts. You picture a group seeking shelter, a small natural hollow, a rock overhang, a temporary windbreak built quickly from snow or wood. Survival in travel is always temporary architecture. The cold here is not passive, it actively shapes behaviour. It forces stillness when movement becomes too costly. Inside the longhouse, this danger feels distant but not imaginary. People here understand it deeply. Every returning traveller carries the reminder of it. Frost-covered clothing, slow speech, hands still stiff from cold. These are signals of what the outside world is doing at that moment. There is still uncertainty among historians about how frequently Viking communities attempted long-distance winter travel versus waiting for seasonal stability. Some evidence suggests reduced movement during harsh months, while coastal routes may have remained partially active depending on conditions. You hold both possibilities without needing resolution. Movement continues, but only when the world permits it. You imagine the relief of finally seeing smoke from a settlement through falling snow. That moment when distance becomes safety again, when cold begins to loosen its grip. A fire seen from afar is not just warmth, it is confirmation that survival is still possible. You return mentally to the longhouse once more. The contrast is sharp now. Outside is uncertainty in motion, inside is controlled stillness. But both are connected. The same people move between them. The same skills apply in both spaces: awareness, timing, and respect for conditions. Winter travel is not separate from survival inside shelter. It is another form of it. And every return from the storm is a reminder of what the walls protect against. You remain within the longhouse's steady warmth, but now your awareness shifts toward the quieter forces of survival, the ones that do not hunt fish or build walls, but instead shape the fabric of daily life in ways that are easy to overlook. You begin to notice the presence of work that continues even in stillness. Not all survival depends on strength or fire. Some of it depends on hands moving in rhythm with patience. Weaving becomes one of those quiet lifelines. You imagine the sound first, not loud but constant, the soft rhythm of wool being worked through wooden looms, a steady back and forth motion that fills the background of winter life. A mainstream historical fact supported by textile archaeology is that Viking societies produced extensive wool textiles using upright looms, and weaving was primarily carried out by women within households, forming a critical part of winter survival economies. You picture the interior of the longhouse again, but now with a different focus. Near the fire, not only warmth but labour. A loom standing upright, its wooden frame catching firelight as threads stretch vertically like lines of frozen rain. Hands move carefully, not rushed. Each motion measured because mistakes in weaving are not easily undone. Wool must be guided, not forced. The smell here is different too. Damp wool natural oils, faint smoke, and the obvious scent of raw fibre. It blends into the same atmosphere as everything else, but carries its own identity. You imagine fingers working cold yarn, occasionally warmed near the fire before continuing. Even indoor work is shaped by temperature. A quirky detail often discussed in experimental textile studies is that Viking-era wool often retained natural lanolin oils which helped make garments water-resistant without additional treatment, in some cases especially for outer garments exposed to winter weather. You can almost feel that texture now. Slightly greasy wool fibres, dense and strong, designed to resist snow and wind rather than feel soft. You notice how weaving is not just production, it is planning. Every thread contributes to future warmth. Every completed cloth becomes clothing, bedding, sails or coverings that will define survival in coming months. Nothing here is separate from necessity. You shift your attention to repair work as well. Torn fabric being mended, fur stitched back together. Sails reinforced for ships that will not sail until weather allows. Even winter labour is future-oriented. A mainstream historical observation is that textile production and repair were continuous year-round activities in Viking societies, with winter providing the necessary indoor time for maintenance work that supported maritime and household needs. You imagine this continuity now. Summer builds, winter maintains, nothing is ever truly finished, only preserved and improved. Outside wind continues its long pressure against the walls, but inside weaving transforms that pressure into preparation. Every garment created is a response to what waits beyond the door. You notice how weaving also shapes social space. It brings people together in shared tasks. Conversation flows around it. Stories are told between motions. Even science becomes rhythmic, matched to the movement of hands and thread. There is still uncertainty among historians about how standardized textile patterns and techniques were across Viking regions, with evidence suggesting both local variation and shared cultural traditions across broader Norse societies. You accept that variation easily now. What matters is not uniformity but function. Every community adapts weaving to its own climate and needs. You imagine finished cloth now. Thick, tightly woven wool cut and shaped into garments that will later be layered against cold. Each piece carries hours of labour embedded within it. When worn, it becomes invisible protection. You feel how deeply interconnected this system is. Animals provide wool, hands transform it, firelight supports the work, bodies eventually wear it. Everything cycles through necessity. A quiet realization forms now. Even stillness inside the longhouse is not idle. It's productive in hidden ways. You're always preparing for something, even while resting, even while winter continues outside. And in that quiet preparation, survival becomes continuous, not seasonal. You remain in the steady rhythm of woven life and winter firelight, but now your awareness turns towards something smaller, more delicate, and surprisingly powerful in shaping survival. Not strength, not structure, not even fire, but learning. You begin to notice how the longhouse is filled not only with labour, but with observation. Winter is long enough that knowledge becomes something absorbed slowly like heat through wood. You imagine children moving quietly through the space, not formally taught but always present, always watching. Their learning is not separated from life, it is embedded in it. A mainstream historical fact supported by anthropological comparisons and saga traditions is that Viking children were integrated early into household labour and cultural practices, learning essential survival skills through observation and participation rather than formal schooling. You picture a child sitting near the edge of the firelight, hands occupied with simple tasks. Not idle, never idle. Even small actions contribute to the household rhythm. They watch how adults tend fire, how food is divided, how tools are handled, how clothing is repaired. Every action is a lesson repeated until it becomes instinct. The air feels softer here, not warmer in temperature but gentler in movement. Children bring a different energy into the longhouse even in winter. A quirky detail often suggested in archaeological interpretations of learning environments is that miniature tools and practice objects found in some Viking sites may indicate that children were given scaled-down versions of adult implements to safely learn practical skills. You imagine that now, a small wooden knife, a tiny loom, a reduced version of the tools that define survival, allowing practice without full risk. You notice how storytelling from earlier sections now blends into learning. Children do not just listen for entertainment, they absorb structure, memory, and cultural identity through repetition. Names, lineages, roots, rules of survival, all carried in spoken form. You begin to understand how knowledge persists here without writing as a dominant system. It lives in people. It moves between generations like breath. A mainstream historical observation is that Norse culture relied heavily on oral transmission of knowledge, including legal customs, genealogy, and navigation techniques, with memorization and repetition playing a central role in maintaining social continuity. You feel the weight of that now. Knowledge is not stored, it is carried. Inside the longhouse, winter becomes the classroom, not separate from survival, but identical to it. You imagine a young person learning how to judge weather by sound, how to read wind direction by smoke, how to recognize safe ice by subtle visual cues. These are not abstract skills, they are life and death interpretations of the environment. There is still uncertainty among historians about how formalized apprenticeship systems were in Viking households, but most agree that skill transmission was highly practical and closely tied to daily labourer roles. You hold that uncertainty gently again. Structure may vary, but learning remains constant. You notice how mistakes are treated here, not punished harshly, but corrected immediately. A missed step in fire tending, a poorly tied knot, a weakened stitch in fabric. Each error becomes instruction. The longhouse itself participates in teaching. Cold drafts reveal gaps in construction. Smoke reveals airflow behaviour. Fire reveals fuel quality. Everything becomes feedback. You imagine how deeply awareness of environment becomes embedded in people raised here. They do not simply live in winter. They interpret it constantly. A child watching frost form on a wall learns timing. Someone observing snowdrift patterns learns wind direction. Someone listening to ice crack learns caution. Nothing is separate from education. You feel how even silence teaches. The absence of sound outside the walls is not emptiness. It is information about weather conditions and storm intensity. Inside the fire continues its steady presence, and with it the quiet transmission of knowledge. You realise something subtle now. In this world, survival is not inherited as comfort. It is inherited as understanding. And understanding is built slowly every day inside the longhouse. You remain within the longhouse where learning and survival blend into the same quiet rhythm, but now the atmosphere shifts again. Something less tangible begins to enter the space, something that does not build walls, weave cloth, or tend fire. It is meaning. You notice it in the stillness that gathers before certain moments, the way conversation slows, the way people sit a little differently, as if listening not only to each other, but to something beyond the walls. Winter nights are long enough that the mind begins to search for patterns in everything, not just survival patterns, but deeper ones. You imagine a hush falling over the hall. The fire still burns, but its sound feels more distant now. Shadows stretch across beams like silent figures watching. A mainstream historical fact supported by Norse literary sources is that seasonal rituals and communal practices were an important part of Viking social life, particularly during winter, when communities gathered indoors and reinforced shared beliefs through ceremonies and offerings. You feel that presence now as something subtle, not dramatic, not spectacle, more like a shared acknowledgement that the world outside the longhouse is larger and more unpredictable than any structure can fully control. You picture small rituals taking place near the fire, offerings placed carefully, quiet words spoken, not for display but for reassurance. The air feels heavier in a different way, not smoke heavy or wool heavy, but meaning heavy, as if attention itself changes the atmosphere. A quirky detail often discussed in interpretations of Norse ritual practice is that domestic spaces, including longhouses, may have doubled as ceremonial spaces, meaning that daily life and ritual life were not strictly separated in the way modern categories suggest. You imagine that overlap now, a place where eating, sleeping, working, and reflecting all happen within the same walls. No separation between sacred and ordinary, only degrees of attention. You notice how people's expressions shift in these moments, less focused on tasks, more inward. Thoughts turn toward forces that cannot be directly controlled. Weather, fate, survival, time. There is still uncertainty among historians about how formalized Viking religious practice was in domestic settings versus designated outdoor sites, with evidence suggesting a blend of both depending on region and household status. You hold that uncertainty like everything else, not as confusion but as openness. You begin to imagine how winter itself becomes part of this meaning-making. Endless darkness naturally invites reflection. When the world outside disappears for so long, the inside becomes more than shelter. It becomes a place for interpretation. You feel how stories from earlier sections begin to change tone in memory. They are no longer just entertainment. They become carriers of identity, resilience, and shared understanding of existence in a harsh world. A mainstream historical observation is that pre-modern societies in northern climates often integrated seasonal cycles into cultural and spiritual frameworks, using winter as a time of reflection, consolidation, and communal reinforcement. You imagine that now as a cycle. Summer is action, winter is meaning. One gathers resources, the other gathers understanding. The fire flickers again, and its light feels almost symbolic in this moment. Constant, fragile, necessary. You notice how silence spreads across the hall again, but it is not emptiness. It is shared awareness, a collective pause in the rhythm of survival. People are still present, still breathing, still alive in the most immediate sense, but attention has shifted towards something less physical. You imagine the feeling of standing inside that pause, warmth around you, cold beyond the walls, and between them a sense of continuity that is not easily explained. Outside winter remains unchanged, indifferent, absolute. Inside meaning softens that absoluteness, not by defeating it but by placing it within human understanding. And for a moment the longhouse is not just shelter. It's a place where existence is interpreted together. You remain in the quiet weight of meaning inside the longhouse, but now your awareness shifts again, moving beyond shared rituals and into something more personal, more vast, and more uncertain. Belief. not as doctrine written down, but as something carried through winter nights shaped by firelight storms and the long absence of the sun. You imagine the darkness outside stretching endlessly, pressing against the walls like a living presence. In that kind of night, the mind naturally searches for explanation for structure in what cannot be controlled. A mainstream historical fact supported by Norse literary sources is that Viking belief systems included a complex pantheon of gods associated with natural forces, fate and survival, reflecting the realities of life in harsh and unpredictable northern environments. You feel how that worldview fits the world you've been walking through. Cold that arrives without warning, storms that reshape land, darkness that refuses to end for weeks. Everything outside the longhouse feels larger than human intention. Inside, people speak quietly of forces that give shape to that unpredictability, not always in fear but in familiarity, as if naming what cannot be controlled makes it slightly closer to understanding. You imagine the names of gods spoken near the fire, not as distant mythology but as part of daily language. Protection, endurance, guidance through storms both physical and unseen. A quirky detail often discussed in comparative mythology studies is that many Norse deities were closely tied to natural and seasonal cycles, suggesting that belief systems were deeply intertwined with environmental observation, rather than separated from daily survival. You begin to feel that connection now. The storm outside is not just weather. It is experience interpreted through meaning. The long winter night is not only absence of light, it is a condition that shapes thought itself. You picture someone sitting quietly near the edge of the firelight, fingers resting on worn wood eyes, half focused not on the room, but on something inward. That inwardness is not escape. It is reflection shaped by environment. There is still uncertainty among historians about how uniformly religious belief was practiced across Viking communities, with evidence suggesting significant regional variation and blending of older traditions with newer cultural influences over time. You hold that uncertainty gently again. Belief here is not fixed, it is responsive. It adapts to circumstance, much like everything else in this world. You imagine winter storms reinforcing that sense of scale. Wind pressing so strongly against the longhouse that it feels like the world itself is testing the boundary between inside and outside. In those moments, belief becomes a way of orienting oneself within forces too large to resist directly. A mainstream historical observation is that pre-Christian Norse belief systems often emphasized concepts of fate and inevitability, reflecting a worldview shaped by environments where human control over nature was limited. You feel that idea settle into the space around you. Not as fear, but as acceptance. Cold is not defeated. It is endured. Storms are not prevented. They are survived. Inside the longhouse, fire becomes more than heat again. It becomes continuity, a point of stability in a world defined by instability. You notice how people's expressions soften in this imagined moment, not in certainty, but in shared understanding that survival itself is fragile and temporary, yet still possible. Outside, winter continues without awareness. It does not respond to belief, it does not change for meaning. But inside, belief changes how it is endured, and that difference, small as it seems, becomes part of what allows life to continue through the longest nights. You feel the fire flicker again, steady and persistent, and in its light uncertainty does not disappear. It simply becomes something that can be lived within. You remain inside the longhouse where belief and firelight settle into a shared calm, but now your awareness begins to move outward again, beyond the walls, beyond the immediate winter night, toward the fragile threads that connect this isolated world to everything beyond it. Because even here, surrounded by snow and darkness, nothing truly exists alone. You begin to imagine distant routes stretching across frozen landscapes and open seas, paths not always visible but remembered travelled when conditions allow, and waited upon when they do not. Winter feels like isolation, but it's never complete separation. A mainstream historical fact supported by archaeological and trade evidence is that Viking societies were part of extensive trade networks that connected Scandinavia with regions across Europe, the North Atlantic and beyond, allowing goods, ideas and materials to circulate even across vast distances. You picture those connections now like faint lines across a vast white map, not constant movement but periodic exchange. Moments when the world opens and then closes again under seasonal pressure. Inside the longhouse, goods arrive slowly. Not frequently, not predictably, but significantly when they do. You imagine rare items carried through cold distances. Metalwork, cloth, salt, grain, or crafted objects that cannot be produced locally. Each one represents a journey through weather, terrain, and risk. The smell of unfamiliar materials enters the hall when such goods arrive. Different wood, different fabric, different oils. The outside world briefly becomes present inside. A quirky detail often discussed in trade archaeology is that Viking exchange systems often relied not only on formal trade but also on gift-giving and reciprocal relationships, meaning that value is maintained through trust and social obligation as much as through standardized currency. You feel that now as something social rather than economic, a system built on relationships rather than transactions. What is given today may return in another season, in another place under different skies. You imagine traders arriving after long journeys, faces weathered by wind and exposure. They bring stories as much as goods, news of distant places, conditions of routes, changes in weather patterns far beyond the fjords. There is still uncertainty among historians about how consistent long-distance winter travel was across Viking regions, with some evidence suggesting seasonal limitations, while other accounts indicate remarkable adaptability in certain coastal and maritime routes. You hold that uncertainty in place again. Movement here is never guaranteed. It is negotiated with weather distance and survival capacity. Inside the longhouse, the arrival of foreign goods is more than material benefit. It is connection, a reminder that the world extends beyond snowbound isolation. You notice how people respond to such arrivals, subtle shifts in energy, curiosity, attention, a sense that the boundary between inside and outside has briefly thinned. A mainstream historical observation is that Viking Age trade routes facilitated not only material exchange, but also cultural interaction, contributing to shared technologies, artistic styles, and navigational knowledge across regions. You imagine that influence now, a carved pattern from one region appearing in another, a technique for shipbuilding spreading through contact, a way of reading wind or water passed from traveller to traveller. Inside the longhouse, winter still dominates daily life, but these connections remind everyone that winter is not the whole world. You picture maps that do not exist on paper but in memory, routes learned through repetition, coastal lines remembered by shape, rivers known by sound and flow beneath ice. Even when travel stops, those maps remain in people's minds, waiting for seasons to open again. Outside, wind continues its pressure. Inside, the idea of distance softens slightly, not removed but made familiar. You realize something subtle now. This longhouse is not just a shelter against cold. It's also a node in a wider network of movement, memory and exchange. Even in winter, the world is still connected. It's just moving more slowly. You remain in the longhouse where distant trade and memory of movement still linger in your awareness. But now your focus shifts to something more familiar in stories about Vikings, and yet often misunderstood in its timing and reality. Raiding. You imagine the image that often appears in popular imagination. Ships cutting through waves, warriors stepping onto foreign shores, fire and steel and swift movement. But here inside winter's hold, that image slows, becomes more complicated, more seasonal, more human, because winter changes everything, even ambition. A mainstream historical fact supported by historical scholarship is that Viking raiding activity was strongly seasonal, with most expeditions occurring in warmer months when seas were navigable, and survival conditions at home allowed communities to spare manpower for travel. You feel that shift now. The long winter is not a time for expansion, it is a time for maintenance. Bodies stay closer to home, resources are guarded, not extended. The world contracts inward. Inside the longhouse, warriors are not absent, but they are different here. They are not at sea, they are present in repair planning and waiting. You imagine weapons stored carefully, shields hung along walls, spears repaired or reshaped, not in preparation for immediate battle, but for future possibility. A quirky detail often discussed in Viking archaeology is that many weapon finds show signs of repair and reuse, suggesting that tools of conflict were maintained carefully over long periods rather than discarded after damage, reflecting their value as long-term assets. You picture hands working in winter light, sharpening edges, replacing bindings, oil applied to metal to prevent corrosion from damp air and smoke. Even instruments of war are shaped by the domestic winter labour. There is still uncertainty among historians about how structured Viking raiding planning was during winter months, with some suggesting informal preparation periods and others pointing to more organised seasonal cycles depending on leadership and region. You hold that uncertainty gently. What matters is not exact scheduling, but the rhythm of pause and action dictated by climate. Outside winter seas are dangerous. Ice forms unpredictably along coasts, storms make navigation unreliable. Even experienced sailors would hesitate to push outward into unstable conditions. You imagine ships pulled ashore resting in sheltered coves or riverbanks, hulls protected, repairs done slowly, ropes checked, planks reinforced, everything waiting for spring. A mainstream historical observation is that Viking longships required regular maintenance and favourable weather conditions for safe travel, making winter months largely unsuitable for long-distance maritime raids or exploration. You feel that stillness now as part of a larger cycle. Winter is not absence of action, it is preparation compressed into patience. Inside the longhouse, stories about past journeys may circulate, not as active plans, but as memory. Raids completed in previous seasons become narrative identity and instruction. You notice how perception of raiding changes in this context. It is no longer constant motion, it is episodic, structured by environment rather than desire alone. Even those known for movement must yield to winter's pause. You imagine the emotional rhythm of that pause, restlessness contained by necessity, energy redirected inward, tools maintained instead of deployed, plans formed but not executed. And in that restraint another kind of survival emerges, not survival of the body alone, but survival of intent waiting for the right moment to return. Outside, the world is too frozen for expansion. Inside, everything is held in readiness, like breath before movement. You remain inside the longhouse where preparation and restraint define the winter rhythm, but now your awareness moves towards something quieter again. Not people, not planning, but the vessels that once carried them across frozen horizons. Ships. Even in winter, they are never forgotten. They are simply waiting. You imagine them pulled far from the water, now resting on timber supports along sheltered shorelines. Their curved hulls lifted away from ice and waves preserved through cold months like sleeping animals held in careful stillness. A mainstream historical fact supported by archaeological evidence is that Viking longships were routinely hauled onto land during winter for maintenance, repair and preservation, protecting their wooden structures from prolonged exposure to ice and storm conditions. You can almost see that process now. Groups of people working together, ropes creaking under strainwood, scraping against frozen ground, the ship slowly shifting upward from its element into land-bound safety. The smell is distinct in your imagination. Salt drying on wood, tar used for sealing seams, damp timber mixing with cold air. It is the scent of something powerful paused rather than abandoned. You notice how care is given to every part of the vessel. Planks inspected, nails checked, flexible joints reinforced. Nothing is rushed, because when the sea returns to favour, hesitation cannot be afforded. A quirky detail often mentioned in experimental maritime archaeology is that Viking ships were designed with flexibility in their hull construction, allowing them to absorb wave motion, which also meant that regular maintenance was essential to keep structural integrity intact over time. You imagine that flexibility now as both strength and vulnerability. A ship that moves with water must also be constantly cared for on land. Inside the longhouse, people may speak of ships in passing during winter nights, not as immediate tools but as future possibilities, as if they are part of the same household system, extended outward into water and distance. There is still uncertainty among historians about how many ships were actively maintained per household or settlement at any given time, with variations depending on wealth region and maritime activity levels. You accept that uncertainty easily now. What matters is the relationship between people and vessels, not precise numbers. You imagine ropes coiled, neatly stored away from moisture, sails carefully folded and hung indoors to prevent rot. Every component of the ship separated and tended like parts of a living system. Even when inactive, the ship is not dead, it is maintained a potential. Outside winter continues its pressure, but ships held on land are temporarily removed from that pressure. They exist in a different state of readiness. You begin to feel how deeply maritime identity is woven into this world. The longhouse is shelter, but the ship is extension. One protects life, the other extends it outward when conditions allow. A mainstream historical observation is that Viking maritime culture relied heavily on seasonal cycles, with seafaring activity increasing significantly during warmer months when navigation and survival conditions were more stable. You imagine the anticipation that builds through winter, not urgency but readiness, the knowledge that when ice loosens and winds shift, movement will return. You picture sailors looking at their ships during cold months, not with impatience but familiarity, as if checking on something that is still part of their identity even while still. There is something quietly balanced about this relationship. Land and sea, rest and motion, winter and travel. Inside the longhouse, fire continues to burn. Outside, ships rest under snow and frost. And between them, people wait for the world to open again. Not all at once, but in season. You remain in the longhouse's steady warmth where ships rest in memory, and winter holds the outside world in suspension. But now your awareness turns inward again, towards something even closer than ships or fire or shelter. It turns toward the animals that share this survival with you. Because in this world, humans do not live alone. They live alongside other lives that quietly absorb the same winter. You imagine barns and enclosed spaces connected to the longhouse where livestock are brought in during the harshest months. The air there is warmer, denser, filled with breath and body heat from animals that become part of the household ecosystem. A mainstream historical fact supported by archaeological and historical research is that Viking and early medieval Northern European households often housed livestock indoors during winter months, using animal body heat as a supplementary source of warmth and maintaining animal survival during extreme cold. You feel that closeness now in your imagination, the shared breath of humans and animals in confined space. Heat generated not by fire alone but by life itself. Cattle shift slowly in dim light. Sheep press together instinctively. The sound is constant but subdued. Hooves on packed earth. Quiet chewing. Occasional movement in the dark. The smell is stronger here. Earth, straw, animal fur and damp warmth. It is not clean in any modern sense, but it is alive. It is functional. It is survival in its most direct form. You notice how this arrangement benefits both sides. Animals receive shelter from wind and snow. Humans receive heat, milk, and future food security. Nothing is separate. Everything is exchanged. A quirky detail often noted in experimental reconstructions of northern farming systems is that animal housing within human dwellings or attached structures could significantly raise ambient temperatures, especially in small or tightly built longhouses during winter nights. You imagine that subtle rise in warmth now, not dramatic like fire, but steady, a living heat source that changes the temperature gradient of the entire space. Inside the longhouse, this principle extends further. Every body contributes heat. Humans, animals, even stored organic materials all influence the interior climate. You begin to understand how deeply integrated this system is. Nothing here exists purely for one purpose. Everything has multiple roles. Animals provide milk, meat, wool, leather, and heat. Their presence is not secondary. It is structural. There is still uncertainty among historians about how consistently livestock were housed indoors across different Viking regions, with evidence suggesting variation depending on climate severity, settlement size, and available building space. You hold that variation without needing resolution. What matters is the principle of integration between life forms in survival conditions. You imagine the routine of feeding animals during winter, carrying stored hay or fodder through cold air, ensuring water does not freeze, checking enclosures against wind and snow. These tasks become part of daily rhythm, just like tending fire or repairing tools. A mainstream historical observation is that mixed farming systems in Viking Age Scandinavia combined crop cultivation and animal husbandry in a tightly interdependent cycle, with winter requiring careful management of stored feed and indoor housing. You feel how labour expands in winter rather than contracts. Even though the outside world slows, inside activity becomes more concentrated. You notice how children may be involved here too. Learning to care for animals as part of household responsibility. Feeding, cleaning, observing behaviour. Another layer of learning embedded in survival. The soundscape of this space is different from the main hall. Less fire, more breathing. Less storytelling, more repetition of care. You imagine standing within it. Warmth is not uniform but layered again. Animal heat rising from below. Fire heat drifting from nearby. Body heat circulating through close proximity. There is still uncertainty among historians about the exact spatial arrangement of human and animal cohabitation in Viking settlements, but many agree that proximity played a significant role in maintaining warmth and resource efficiency during winter. You begin to see the patterns again. Fire bodies, animals, walls, stored food, all contributing in different ways to the same outcome. Survival is not a single system. It's a network of living and non-living elements cooperating under pressure. Outside, winter remains unchanged. It presses, waits, and surrounds. Inside, life multiplies warmth in every available form, and in that shared heat even the cold becomes manageable. You remain inside the longhouse where fire, clothing, and even animals contribute to survival. But now your awareness shifts inward once again towards something far less tangible, the mind itself and its endurance in endless winter nights. Because survival is not only about heat, food, or shelter, it is also about psychological stamina. You imagine the darkness outside pressing relentlessly against the walls. Daylight disappears for weeks, replaced by a faint grey twilight at best. In such conditions, the human mind naturally searches for structure, comfort, and continuity. A mainstream historical fact supported by environmental studies and ethnographic parallels is that long winters in northern climates required adaptive coping strategies including social cohesion, structured routines, and cultural practices to maintain mental well-being. You sense that necessity now in the rhythm of the longhouse. Fire, tending, storytelling, weaving, care for animals, all of it is not only practical but psychological. Each task structures the day, gives purpose and anchors attention. You notice how silence behaves differently here. It is never empty. It carries expectation memory and subtle cues. Even minimal sounds, crackling fire, shifting straw, animal breath become indicators of life continuity and comfort. A quirky detail often discussed in studies of human adaptation to Arctic darkness is that some northern societies developed intentional forms of mental engagement such as games, riddles, and evening storytelling sessions to combat monotony and maintain alertness during months of reduced light. You imagine that engagement now, children whispering riddles, adults recalling past events, laughter soft but present. These small mental exercises become invisible lifelines, strengthening endurance in ways warmth alone cannot provide. You begin to feel how rhythm itself supports the mind. Predictable patterns of daily life, feeding animals, tending fires, repairing clothing, create a sense of order that helps counter the anxiety induced by constant darkness. There is still uncertainty among historians about how much deliberate psychological strategies versus cultural habituation contributed to resilience, but evidence suggests both were critical to surviving prolonged isolation. You imagine a lone observer in a distant corner of the longhouse, breathing slowly, counting repetitions in a small task, using it as a meditative anchor. Even the repetition of movement and sound becomes a subtle form of mental protection. Outside, the wind presses against the walls again. Inside, the mind engages with patterns. It does not eliminate the pressure, but it organizes it. You picture people clustering together in conversation, hands rubbing, eyes flicking toward each other for reassurance. Emotional and cognitive endurance is shared here as much as physical warmth. A mainstream historical observation is that social cohesion and collective activity were essential in pre-modern northern communities, especially during long winters, serving both practical survival and mental resilience. You feel how intertwined physical and psychological endurance are. Warmth preserves life, structure preserves attention, shared tasks preserve morale, every element supports the others. The longhouse itself becomes a kind of externalized mind. Walls fire and occupants create a feedback loop that sustains more than just bodies. You notice subtle signs of strain, a yawn, a pause, a lingering hesitation before action. Even in resilience, fatigue manifests. Recognition of these signs allows adjustment, a built-in coping system. You imagine how the mind anticipates daylight. Even in total darkness, the approach of months with longer days brings a shift in rhythm and expectation, creating a psychological horizon beyond immediate survival. Inside, night continues, yet fear, monotony and isolation are held at bay by attention, ritual and shared presence. You feel a profound connection now between mind and environment. Endurance is not passive, it is active, layered and maintained through interaction with fire bodies, tasks and social rhythm. And in that interplay, the human spirit finds a way to persist. You remain inside the longhouse where bodies fire and mind intertwine to endure winter. But now your awareness shifts toward the unexpected improvisation. Because even the most carefully planned survival is sometimes challenged by sudden events beyond control. You imagine a sudden snowstorm pressing harder than usual against the walls, or a fire dwindling too low for the night's demands. In these moments, survival depends not on routines alone, but on quick thinking, adaptation and resourcefulness. A mainstream historical fact supported by saga accounts and archaeological evidence is that Viking communities often faced unpredictable weather equipment failures and resource shortages during winter, requiring improvisation in both domestic and survival tasks. You picture someone adjusting ventilation in the longhouse when smoke becomes too heavy. Another carefully rearranges bedding to shield against a draft. A third improvises using spare hides or straw to insulate a vulnerable wall. The air carries the scent of oil smoke and damp wool, but also a subtle tension. Adaptation is not always easy. It demands observation, courage, and immediate action. A quirky detail often discussed in studies of survival strategies is that Norse households may have used seemingly unusual solutions, such as stacking additional turf against walls or temporarily repurposing tools and materials in ways not recorded, formally demonstrating creativity under pressure. You can almost feel the rapid assessment process. Eyes scan, hands move. Resources are evaluated quickly but carefully. Every motion counts. Mistakes can cost warmth, comfort, or even life. Outside, wind and snow continue their relentless movement, indifferent to human planning. Inside, improvisation bends the environment to a temporary order, holding danger at bay. You notice how children and less experienced members are incorporated into these solutions. Even small contributions are critical. A misaligned straw bundle can reduce draft by a measurable degree. Every action carries significance. There is still uncertainty among historians about how frequently these improvised adaptations were necessary versus routine winter maintenance, but all agree that flexibility and responsiveness were essential skills in Arctic survival. You imagine the subtle lessons embedded in these moments. Observation, evaluation, risk management, and resource allocation are learned unconsciously, reinforced through repeated winter experiences. Inside the longhouse hums with quiet activity, not constant labour, but measured adjustments in response to immediate need. Patterns from daily life remain, but now they are punctuated by small deliberate improvisations. A mainstream historical observation is that survival in harsh climates relies not only on preparation, but also on the ability to adapt quickly to unexpected changes, a principle evident in both material culture and oral traditions among northern communities. You feel how each improvisation reinforces both competence and confidence. The household collectively grows in resilience through each minor success, each adjustment that maintains warmth and safety. Even in moments of stress, life continues steadily. The rhythm of fire-tending bedding, clothing, and care for animals continues alongside rapid responses to new challenges. Outside, winter presses relentlessly. Inside, human ingenuity redirects its force, preserving stability and life. You sense the quiet power of these acts. They are small, uncelebrated, yet profound. Improvisation ensures that routines survive disruption, that warmth is maintained, and that the household continues despite unpredictability. And slowly you realize that survival is never just preparation or endurance. It is also creativity, responsiveness, and the subtle intelligence of experience applied in real time. The longhouse itself seems to respond to this awareness, holding body's heat and resourcefulness together as the storm rages just beyond its walls. You remain inside the longhouse where every system of survival, firewalls, clothing, food, animals, and mind has been tested and strengthened through winter. Now at the final edge of your imagined journey, the season begins to shift and a subtle light hints at the return of spring. You notice it first in the rhythm of life inside. Movements are slower, more deliberate. The long nights remain, but the edge of anticipation has arrived. People move with awareness of change as if the world itself is beginning to breathe differently. Stored food remains essential, but the pressure eases slightly. Fire is still tended, but embers carry warmth more easily now, spreading across the hall and softening the constant vigilance that has defined the season. Smoke drifts in calmer patterns, rising steadily through roof vents, and the scent of wood and warmth feels lighter in your imagination. Children shift with renewed energy. Their lessons continue, but with a sense of coming freedom, their laughter lighter, echoing briefly before fading into the hall. Hands that repaired clothing now help with preparing tools for spring. Tasks begin to anticipate a world beyond the winter without abandoning the needs of the present. You notice how sunlight, though still sparse, begins to filter into the edges of the longhouse at unusual angles. It touches walls, illuminating rough timber, worn furs, and straw bedding. Even a faint light feels monumental after months of darkness. Your attention rests on the details, a carved beam catching light, a rope slightly frayed but still functional, a small animal curled comfortably near the fire. A mainstream historical fact supported by environmental and archaeological evidence is that Viking communities closely observed seasonal changes, timing agricultural preparation travel and raiding cycles in coordination with sunlight and weather, making even subtle changes in light deeply significant to daily life. Outside, snow still presses against the walls, but it now has softened edges. Frost is thinner ice, less rigid. Wind remains, but it seems quieter, less urgent. The landscape hints at movement and renewal. A quirky detail often recorded in folklore is that Vikings sometimes measured subtle changes in animal behaviour, such as the activity of birds or the thawing patterns of rivers, to gauge the imminent return of spring and guide preparation for outdoor labour. You imagine that observation in practice, someone noting a bird's flight, another feeling a thin layer of thaw under frozen ground, subtle indicators of timing passed from person to person. Inside, winter rituals fade gently into the background. Offerings are completed. Stories told for the season are remembered, woven into memory for the next long nights. Even belief in gods and spirits feels suffused with a quiet optimism carried in breath and attentive listening rather than ceremony. There is still uncertainty among historians about exactly how Viking communities celebrated the return of a light, as evidence combines material remnants with oral tradition making full interpretation difficult. Yet the essence remains clear anticipation of renewal, structured life in profound ways. You notice the longhouse itself almost sighs. The turf walls have absorbed months of snow and frost. Timber beams have expanded and contracted with repeated cold cycles. Yet the structure endures. It embodies the resilience of those who built it and those who inhabited it. It has protected life-preserved warmth and allowed stories' labour and knowledge to continue. A mainstream historical observation is that Viking winter preparation was holistic, encompassing shelter, food, clothing, social structure and ritual, all interwoven to ensure the continuity of life until seasonal change allowed for mobility and expansion once again. You feel the quiet pulse of community now. Tasks continue, but with less urgency, more reflection. Laughter blends with the crackle of fire. Breath becomes calmer. Even silence is softened, layered with expectation rather than tension. Outside, the world begins to lighten imperceptibly. The sun returning gradually casts faint shadows across snowfrost and frozen rivers. It does not yet chase away cold completely, but it promises transformation. The long nights will end. The season of waiting will transition into activity, growth and movement. Inside life absorbs that promise. People pause, noticing changes in light temperature and air. They breathe together. They prepare. They rest. They learn and teach. They watch over animals, maintain tools, and care for each other. All of it is part of the continuous rhythm of survival and adaptation. And now, as the final moments of winter fold into early spring, you feel that gentle release the seasons wait, lessening the longhouse, holding all that life endurance and knowledge safely until the world opens again. The wind outside still moves, but it is no longer relentless. It becomes another feature of a world gradually returning to colour, warmth, and possibility. You close your eyes in imagination. The longhouse, the fire, the layers of wool and fur, the animals, the bodies, the minds, and the shared stories, all of it rests in quiet equilibrium. The night is not conquered, but it has been endured. Survival has persisted through darkness and cold, through challenge and uncertainty. And now the first hints of light mark the promise of continuation. And in that space you feel the slow, steady pulse of life itself, measured in shared warmth, layered clothing, tended fires, enduring walls, and the quiet resilience of those who lived in the harshest nights. You know that even as winter fades, the lessons of survival, endurance, and cooperation remain carried forward like embers in the returning warmth. Sweet dreams.